It's September 15th, 1978. On a dusty road snaking through the arid lands of Tepuche, on the outskirts of Culiacan, Sinaloa. The air hangs heavy with an invisible tension that seems to freeze time. The evening sun stains the crop fields a bloody orange as a Ford Bronco truck cruises along with a slowness that's about to be shattered by the roar of tragedy. Behind the wheel is a man whose name whispers respect and fear in every corner of the Sierra Madre Occidental. Suddenly, a checkpoint looms on the horizon, blocking the way with the cold steel of authority and uniformed resolve. This isn't a random encounter. It's a date with destiny orchestrated in the shadows of the era's political and military power. When the truck stops, the silence is absolute, broken only by the metallic click of automatic rifles being cocked. Without a word, is a hail of lead tears through the bodywork and the driver's body, violently ending an era that defined Mexico's underworld. The man lying lifeless amid the gun smoke and blood is Pedro Aviles Perez, the architect of the routes that would reshape the global drug trafficking map. But who was this man really, the one hidden behind the nickname, the Lion of the Sierra? And how did he lay the foundations of an empire that defies time? Was he just a precursor to organized crime in a transitional era, or a visionary strategist who grasped before anyone else the symbiosis between geography, social needs, and state corruption? Join me as we dive into the origins of the man who, with his daring and ruthless business sense, he became the first great master of Mexico's contemporary criminal history and the mentor to the most powerful kingpins the world has ever known. Pedro Aviles Perez, born in the heart of Sinaloa's Sierra, wasn't a product of chance, but the result of a geographic and social environment ignored for decades by the country's center. He grew up in a region where mountain law was the only valid rule, and survival depended on adapting to hostile terrain and a subsistence economy. From a young age, Pedro showed a pragmatic intelligence that set him apart from his peers, a knack for reading market needs and human weaknesses that soon led him to ditch traditional farming for a far more lucrative and dangerous crop. His first steps came in an era when opium and marijuana were starting to be seen not just as subsistence or medicinal plants, but as high-demand commodities in the neighboring country to the north. World War II had created a massive need for morphine for wounded soldiers on the fronts in Europe and the Pacific. And Sinaloa, with its perfect climate and natural isolation, became the ideal lab to supply that market. It was in this context of global war and insatiable demand where Pedro Aviles began weaving his web of influence, learning that true power lay not just in brute force, but in logistics and building bridges between mountain production and international distribution. As an ambitious young man, he understood that success wasn't just in the mountains, but in the ports and borders. So he started organizing scattered peasants into a hierarchical structure that ensured a steady flow of goods to the United States. Physically, Aviles was a man who commanded presence without needing flash, with a piercing gaze that seemed to probe the intentions of those around him, and a character that blended the calm of a negotiator with the decisiveness of a warrior. As for his personality, he was a natural strategist, obsessed with details and the security of his routes, an obsession that earned him the respect of allies and the hatred of rivals. Pedro Aviles's childhood is a realm of shadows and legends, marked by the harshness of rural life In a Sinaloa still recovering from the Mexican Revolution's aftermath. As a son of the Sierra Madre, he experienced firsthand the state's absence and the marginalization of farming communities, forging in him a fierce sense of independence and contempt for authorities who only showed up to collect taxes or enforce repression. His parents, calloused-handed farmers with weary eyes, taught him the value of hard work, but also showed him the limits of a life dedicated solely to legal land that barely produced enough to eat. It's said that as a boy, Pedro watched with curiosity the passage of mule drivers and traders crossing the Sierra, understanding that moving goods was the key to prosperity. This early observation led him to small-scale trade, selling basic goods in remote villages, where he learned to negotiate and earn people's trust. His bond with the mountain community was crucial, as in those early years he built a loyalty network that protected him for decades. To the Sierra peasants, Pedro wasn't a criminal. He was one of their own, who'd found a way to outsmart poverty and bring resources to a forgotten region. This image of a benefactor, cynical at its core, was the foundation of his social power, letting him operate with near absolute impunity in territories where federal laws were just words on distant paper. As he grew, his ambition expanded beyond his village borders, and he began frequenting Sinaloa's urban centers, where drug trafficking was taking shape as a budding industry controlled by local families and corrupt officials. It was in this urban, corrupt environment where Pedro Aviles honed his knowledge of the system's weaknesses, learning that every official had a price, and that fear was as valid a bargaining tool as gold. His youth wasn't just a phase of commercial learning, but also of military and tactical training, as land and water disputes in the Sierra often ended in blood. These displays of violence and the need for self-defense taught Aviles that to survive in the business he was building, he had to be shrewder and more ruthless than his adversaries. Pedro Aviles's rise to the throne of Sinaloa drug trafficking coincided with a radical shift in U.S. narcotics demand after the war's end. With soldiers returning and post-war culture booming, demand for illegal substances skyrocketed, and Aviles was there to capitalize on it with unprecedented efficiency. He introduced logistical innovations that revolutionized the business, like using small planes to fly drugs over the border, avoiding slow, risky ground convoys that were easy prey for authorities. This aerial vision of trafficking let him move tons of product in a fraction of the time his competitors took, solidifying his reputation as the quick one of the Sierra, long before other kingpins adopted similar nicknames. His ability to organize clandestine air bridges required a complex network of landing strips in the Sierra and coordinators on the U.S. side, a structure he personally oversaw with manic attention to detail. He wasn't content being a middleman. Pedro wanted to control every link in the chain, from the seed in the furrow to the wad of bills in hand. To achieve that, he surrounded himself with ambitious young men whom he trained in the arts of smuggling, negotiation, and strategic violence. Among his protégés were names that would later fill newspaper headlines and DEA files, youths who saw Pedro as a master and role model. He taught them that business depended on discretion and keeping the government at bay through massive bribes and controlled shows of force. Under his command, Sinaloa's drug trafficking shifted from scattered family band activities to a criminal corporation with established routes, security protocols, and dark diplomacy with political power. Aviles understood that business stability depended on internal peace, so he often mediated disputes among other trafficking families, imposing an order that favored steady goods flow. Yet his calm demeanor hid absolute cruelty when it came to betrayals or challenges to his authority. One associate once recounted how Pedro could shift from a friendly chat about farming to ordering an execution without his pulse quickening or his voice changing, a duality that made him doubly dangerous. The 1960s and early 1970s marked Pedro Aviles' golden age, a period when his power seemed boundless and his influence reached the highest spheres of state and federal government. During these years, Sinaloa transformed into the world's epicenter of marijuana production, with massive protected crops thanks to local authorities' complicity and the mountain's impenetrable terrain. As the Grand Master of the Plaza, Aviles regulated production and ensured Sinaloa products' quality was internationally recognized. His distribution network spread across the country, using not just small planes, but also trains and freight trucks, hiding drugs among legal goods. His concealment methods were legendary. He's said to be one of the pioneers in vacuum packing marijuana and using hidden vehicle compartments that defied the toughest inspections. But his biggest innovation wasn't technical, it was political. Aviles was the first to establish what we now know as the plaza, a system where the trafficker pays regular fees to authorities for protection and territorial exclusivity. This pact with the devil allowed Sinaloa to experience a phony prosperity, fueled by narco dollars flowing into cities and towns, funding infrastructure, legal businesses, and political campaigns. Pedro became a shadow power figure, someone politicians turned to for social stability in rural areas, and businessmen sought for fresh capital. Despite his immense wealth, Aviles kept a relatively low profile compared to the kingpins who followed him. He preferred the Sierra's security and the discretion of his safe houses in Culiacan. Yet his lifestyle wasn't without luxuries. He owned vast ranches. He purebred horses and a fleet of vehicles for quick movement across his domains. His relationship with local communities remained that of a protector. He funded patron saint festivals, built churches, and settled local disputes, earning loyalty the government could never buy. This symbiosis between crime and community let his organization withstand the federal government's sporadic attempts to regain control. Aviles knew that as long as the people were on his side, soldiers would be seen as invaders and informants eliminated before they could talk. His strategic vision also included business diversification, starting to explore cocaine trafficking from the South, understanding the U.S. market was always hungry for new, more potent highs. The power balance Pedro Aviles had built so carefully began cracking in the mid-1970s. It's when international pressure, especially from the United States, forced the Mexican government to launch a real offensive against drug trafficking. The response was Operation Condor, a massive military deployment in the Golden Triangle aimed at eradicating crops and dismantling criminal organizations through brute force and chemical herbicides like Agent Orange. For Pedro Aviles, Operation Condor was the start of a siege that tested not just his logistics, but his network of political loyalties. Marijuana fields once protected by local authorities were now bombed from the air and occupied by thousands of soldiers who didn't take the usual bribes. The Sierra turned into a war zone, with daily clashes between Aviles' hitmen and federal troops, and civilians were caught in a violent, systematic repression. So Aviles was forced to retreat to his remotest hideouts, directing resistance from underground and watching his routes disrupted and his lieutenants arrested or killed. It was during this crisis that his young protégés, led by a shrewd ex-cop named Miguel Felix Gallardo, gained prominence, managing city businesses while their master dealt with military harassment in the mountains. Operation Condor didn't just destroy crops, it shattered the impunity pact that had allowed plaza stability. Many of Aviles' political protectors, fearing being dragged into the federal offensive or seeking more lucrative new alliances, began turning their backs or leaking info on his movements. The Lion of the Sierra found himself vulnerable for the first time. He hunted by a state he'd helped corrupt, and now using him as a scapegoat to satisfy Washington's demands. Despite the pressure, Pedro refused to leave Sinaloa or negotiate a surrender he saw as humiliation. His resistance was fierce, organizing ambushes on military convoys and keeping drug flow via increasingly dangerous alternate routes. Yet the war's cost was unsustainable, and paranoia seeped into his inner circle. He started suspecting his own men, fearing the bounty on his head was enough to break decades-old loyalties. Operation Condor was the catalyst that transformed Mexico's drug trafficking from a quasi-state-regulated activity to an open, bloody war for territorial control. A war where Pedro Aviles would be the first high-profile victim. On September 15th, 1978, the atmosphere in Culiacan was one of tense calm, typical of national celebration days, hiding the city's underground conflicts. Pedro Aviles Perez, perhaps sensing the noose tightening, decided to move from his Sierra refuge to the state capital for a meeting that never happened. His route was monitored from the moment his Ford Bronco crossed city limits. A surveillance involving federal police and army elements instructed not to let him escape. The Tepuche checkpoint wasn't a traffic coincidence, but the endpoint of an intelligence op aimed at eliminating the Lion of the Sierra for good. When soldiers flagged him down, Pedro, used to his name opening every door, didn't try to flee right away. It's said he got out of the truck intending to talk or bribe the officers, as he'd done hundreds of times before. But times had changed, and orders were clear. What followed was a slaughter. Bursts from automatic rifles hit him and his companions with a fury that spoke of summary execution more than a legitimate firefight. The body of the man who'd ruled Sinaloa for 3 decades lay in the dust, surrounded by shell casings from a betrayal orchestrated from Central Power's shadows. News of his death spread through the Sierra like wildfire, sparking disbelief and fear among peasants who saw him as their protector. For the federal government, eliminating Aviles was touted as Operation Condor's big win, proof the state could take down the untouchables. But for those who knew drug trafficking's inner workings, his death was just the start of a violent restructuring. His protégés, the young men he'd taught everything about the business, didn't take long to fill the power vacuum. Miguel Felix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo inherited the roots, contacts, and infrastructure Pedro had built, but with a far more aggressive corporate vision. Aviles' death marked the end of the Sierra's romantic pioneer era and the beginning of transnational cartels where violence would be industrialized and corruption reach levels Pedro never imagined. His fall was the final lesson for his successors. In the drug world, the only constant is betrayal, and the only certainty is that no one, not even the Lion of the Sierra, is indispensable to the system. Pedro Aviles Perez's legacy is a shadow still cast over contemporary Sinaloa, an echo of an era when the rules were set for a game Mexico still plays with devastating consequences. He designed the prototype of the Mexican narco, the Sierra Man using technology and corruption to build a global empire while maintaining social support through paternalism and charity. His influence traces through every tunnel, every plane crossing the border, and every dark pact between crime and political power. Aviles wasn't just a trafficker. He was the master who professionalized illegal activity, turning it into a high-efficiency logistics industry. His successors, the Guadalajara Cartel's founders, took his teachings to the next level, but always on the foundations Pedro laid with patience and blood. Aviles's figure has been mythologized in the region's narco corridos. He remembered as the brave man who defied the government and brought progress to the Sierra, a romantic image ignoring the violence and chaos his business sowed in society. Yet his true importance lies in his ability to understand the institutional weakness of the Mexican state and exploit it for his gain, creating an impunity system that has endured for decades after his death. Yet his true importance lies in his ability to understand the institutional weakness of the Mexican state and exploit it for his gain, creating an impunity system that has endured for decades after his death. Today, Pedro Aviles' name is little known to the general public outside Sinaloa, eclipsed by his students' media figures like El Chapo Guzman or Felix Gallardo. But in DEA files and the Sierra's collective memory, he's still recognized as the common trunk from which all branches of modern Mexican drug trafficking sprouted. His life and death remind us that organized crime doesn't arise in a vacuum, but from the cracks of an unequal society and a political system that prefers negotiating with shadows over confronting them. In the end, Pedro Aviles Perez was the man who opened drug trafficking's Pandora's box in Sinaloa. And though he died on a dusty road nearly half a century ago, the world he helped create keeps spinning with seemingly endless violence. Was Pedro Aviles just an ambitious peasant trapped by his era's circumstances? Or the dark genius who laid the groundwork for systematically destroying peace in Mexico through institutionalizing drug trafficking? The answer lies in Sinaloa's mountains, where the Lion of the Sierra still roars in the memory of those who saw the empire of illegality born. Drop your thoughts in the comments about this forgotten precursor. And if you're hooked on these stories of figures who forged history's dark side, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dives into the men who changed entire nations' fates from the shadows. Pedro Aviles Perez was born in a time of silence and grew up in a land of secrets, and his story is the key to understanding a region's bloody present that could never escape its own geography. The first master is dead, but his lessons are still applied with terrifying precision by those who rule the Golden Triangle's shadows today. To grasp the magnitude of Pedro Aviles's empire, yet you have to picture the vastness of the Sierra Madre Occidental during the 1940s and 50s, a massive mountain range serving as an impregnable sanctuary for illegal activity. Back then, paths were barely passable mule trails, and communication with the outside world was practically non-existent, letting opium poppy cultivation spread across valleys and slopes without authority interference. Aviles, with a vision surpassing any common farmer's, began unifying small producers under a single quality brand and transport network. He understood dispersion was their biggest weakness and cohesion their greatest strength. So he set up collection centers at strategic Sierra points, where opium paste was weighed and paid with British punctuality, securing the unconditional loyalty of thousands of mountain families who saw him as their only real employer. This logistical structure made Sinaloa the main heroin supplier to the U.S. market during the war years, a position Aviles defended with a mix of diplomacy and firepower. Using light planes like Cessnas was his masterstroke. He built landing strips in the most unlikely spots, often on mountain ridges, where only a steel-nerved pilot could land. These pilots, many war veterans or unscrupulous adventurers, became his organization's elite, hauling not just drugs north, but weapons and cash south. Pedro personally oversaw these aircraft's maintenance and cruise training, knowing a single technical error could mean losing a fortune or his men. Aviles' organization was the first to operate like a true cartel before the term caught on, with departments for production, logistics, security, and political lobbying. His corruption reach went beyond road cops to generals, governors, and federal agents who saw Pedro's business as an endless source of side income. These officials tipped off imminent ops, freed detained members, and eased cargo passage on federal highways. The Lion of the Sierra navigated this shadow world with rustic elegance, dressing simply but always carrying an authority that needed no uniforms. It's said his meetings with top government brass happened at private ranches, where amid meals, cigars, and banda music, deals were sealed, letting Sinaloa remain Mexico's drug garden. Yet Aviles never made the mistake of fully trusting his uniformed partners. He always kept contingency plans and a private security force of utterly trusted men, trained in long guns and mountain survival. This duality between political negotiation and firepower let him stay on top so long, dodging political crises and administration changes with astonishing skill. But the world was changing, and Washington's growing concern over drug flows began pressuring the Mexican government to end the tolerance era. Aviles, sensing the wind shift, started diversifying investments into legit businesses, buying hotels, construction firms, and farmland, seeking a graceful exit from a trade turning more violent and watched. But the past always finds a way to collect its dues. And for a man who'd built power on illegality, peaceful retirement was an unattainable dream. His Operation Condor siege started an erosion process that weakened his defenses and left him exposed to the final betrayal. The soldiers burning his fields weren't the same officers who took his envelopes. They were fresh troops with direct central orders, driven by war on crime rhetoric, leaving no room for old arrangements. Aviles watched his world crumble. Yesterday's friends become today's hunters, and the Sierra he loved fill with bodies and chemical smoke. His resistance was epic but desperate, a fight against history's tide that finally dragged him to that fatal Tepuche checkpoint. Pedro Aviles' fall wasn't just one man's end. It was the end of a way to understand drug trafficking in Mexico. A way that, though criminal, kept certain codes of conduct and mutual respect with the community. After his death, the business passed to men lacking his moderation or long-term vision. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, his top student, grasped the future lay in Colombian cocaine and creating a cartel federation controlling the whole country. Caro, Quintero, and Fonseca Carrillo brought mass production and violence that put Mexican trafficking in global headlines with the Camarena case. Pedro Aviles gave them the tools, routes, and contacts, but they ditched the discretion and boundary respect he'd always upheld. Violence turned indiscriminate, executions public, and the state challenge direct, sparking an escalation of repression that's plunged Mexico into decades of bloodshed. If Aviles had lived, maybe Mexican trafficking would have followed a path more like a traditional mafia, discreet and corporate, but his elimination opened the door to barbarity. The Pedro Aviles remains a study subject for crime historians, who see him as the missing link between early-century social banditry and today's transnational organized crime. His grave in Culiacan is visited by those still remembering him as the first boss, leaving flowers and asking favors like a saint. In Sierra towns, his name's still spoken with nostalgia, recalling an era when, they say, there was order and money for all. This past idealization ignores that it was Aviles who sowed systemic corruption seeds, still blocking the region's development. His legacy is a bittersweet mix of phony economic progress and real moral decay, a legacy his heirs have exponentially multiplied. Pedro Aviles Perez's story is ultimately one of a missed opportunity for the Mexican state to legally integrate Sinaloa into national development, instead letting a Sierra man build a parallel state that today seems stronger than the official one. His daring was his engine, his intelligence, his guide, and his ambition his doom. The Lion of the Sierra died as he lived, amid violence and betrayal, leaving a vacuum filled by far more fearsome monsters than him. His influence is undeniable, his historical impact profound, and his figure essential to understanding the complex web of power, crime, and politics defining contemporary Mexico. The first master's shadow lingers, reminding us that in the drug world, foundations are blood and crowns are gunpowder. As we dig deeper into Pedro Aviles' biography, we uncover a man who also had a high-level international negotiator side. He kept direct contacts with distributors in cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. He's setting up a sales network running with modern logistics precision. These distributors, often tied to U.S. criminal outfits, respected Aviles for his seriousness and consistent merchandise quality. Pedro's new reputation was his most valuable asset abroad, so he was ruthless with those trying to adulterate product or miss deadlines. This business seriousness made Sinaloa marijuana a premium brand in the U.S., outdemanding other countries' output. Aviles was also a pioneer in large-scale money laundering, using foreign bank accounts and front companies to fold profits back into the legit financial system. He's said to own U.S. properties in several states where he'd occasionally hole up to oversee business or escape Mexican pressure. His ability to move between the rustic Sierra world and international finance made him unique among contemporaries. While other traffickers lost themselves in their own substances or vulgar wealth displays, Pedro stayed sober and focused, always one step ahead of pursuers. His relationships with women were part of his legend, too. He had several wives and kids scattered across the state, whom he supported generously but under strict security. His children, some who tried following his footsteps, never reached his stature, crushed by a surname drawing too much attention. Aviles was a family man in his way, protective and authoritarian, seeking a life away from his daily dangers for his descendants, though his business reality ended up catching them all. Power's solitude was another constant in his life. As his empire grew, trusted people dwindled, surrounded by flatterers seeking favor and enemies waiting for weakness. This paranoia led him to build underground shelters on his ranches and randomly switch vehicles and routes, a discipline letting him survive several assassination attempts before the final end. Yet the betrayal that killed him didn't come from external enemies, but from the bowels of a system he'd fed. Operation Condor stripped his political shield, and without it, the Lion of the Sierra was easy prey for an army needing a trophy to show the world. His death wasn't a tactical error, but a geopolitical paradigm shift where men like him were no longer useful to central power. Aviles's sacrifice let a new generation of more docile, better integrated traffickers take control, starting the era of narco-paramilitarism and narco-politics plaguing the country today. Pedro Aviles Perez was the architect, master, and victim of a system built to last 100 years, but that devoured him in under 30. His story is the origin of modern evil in Mexico, a story worth telling unfiltered to understand why the Sierra still weeps and why gunpowder remains the official language in Sinaloa lands. At the road's end, Pedro Aviles Perez's figure stands as a warning about the dangers of letting the state's vacuum be filled by criminal ambition. His life testified to human capacity for creating order from chaos, but an order based on illegality and fear. Sinaloa, where he was born and died, remains the storm's epicenter, a territory still without the peace Pedro promised through plaza law. The first master left us a world of shadows, and we're still trying to find the path to light. Thanks for joining us on this journey into Mexican drug trafficking's heart of darkness. We hope this analysis sheds light on a crisis's origins that seems endless. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories revealing the truth behind power and ambition, myths and legends in our time. See you in the next story, where we'll keep exploring contemporary history's darkest corners. Pedro Aviles was the beginning. The end is still being written. Aviles's criminal organization didn't just rely on drug exports. It hinged on ironclad local territorial control. He implemented his own intelligence system, using village youths as informants, the era's pointers, who watched roads and signaled suspicious movement via mirrors and smoke in the Sierra. And this human surveillance net was so effective, the army often patrolled weeks without finding Pedro's camps, passing meters from hidden bunker entrances. His botany knowledge was advanced, too. He experimented with seed varieties from Asia and the Middle East to boost his plants' resistance to pests and the mountain's extreme weather. Seeking technical excellence, he hired agronomists under threat or astronomical salaries, ensuring Sinaloa produced the continent's most potent marijuana and purest opium. Aviles also grasped public image's importance. He was often seen in local markets buying goods and chatting with peasants, portraying himself as a simple man just seeking his people's welfare. This normalcy mask was his best camouflage, letting him move among civilians without raising direct suspicions until too late. His security net included ex-military and ex-cops he'd recruited, offering a life of luxury and action the state couldn't match. These men swore loyalty to the death, and many died defending his convoys or ranches during Operation Condor years. Loyalty in Aviles' world wasn't bought just with money, but with belonging to an elite believing itself above the law. Yet this power structure drew envy and ambition from subordinates. His death's leadership vacuum sparked an internal war lasting years until Felix Gallardo imposed new order under the Guadalajara Cartel. Pedro Aviles was the catalyst pulling trafficking from caves into presidential offices, a legacy of shadows defining the entire American continent's foreign policy and internal security today. In his 1978 death was Prohibitionism's first major sacrifice, an altar demanding thousands more lives, since without stopping the goods flow. Pedro Aviles' Ford Bronco became a monument to individual resistance's futility against global chess shifts, a riddled vehicle symbolizing the fate of all trying to reign in the Sierra. The Lion of the Sierra is gone, but his roar still echoes in every gust crossing Sinaloa's mountains, reminding us the past never dies. It just transforms into a more sophisticated nightmare. Pedro Aviles Perez, a name meaning it all started, the storm's origin engulfing Mexico, rests in a people's memory, still unsure how to break free from his teachings. His story is ours, a story of unchecked ambition, corrupt power, and geography dooming its children to violence. Let this tale serve as a mirror of what we were and still are, a nation seeking its path amid its ancient masters' shadows. Farewell to Pedro Aviles, the first great boss, the Lion of the Sierra, whose death marked Mexico's longest night's start. Aviles was also a strategist in information handling. He controlled what local press said about him through threats and bribes to newspaper directors, creating an info blockade making him seem mystical and almost untouchable. His scarce photos show a man avoiding cameras, always with his hat brim shading part of his face, a ghost materializing only when needed to exert authority. This discretion was his biggest shield for decades, letting him operate in relative anonymity while his power grew exponentially. Rebuilding his empire was a social engineering feat where every piece fit a puzzle of economic and political interests. His Tepuche death was a short circuit in that system, a moment when center interests no longer aligned with the periphery. Pedro Aviles died not for his crimes, but his anachronism. He no longer fit the new Mexico-seeking global economy integration under Washington's watch. His elimination was realpolitik, a needed cleanup for business to evolve into more modern, controllable criminal management forms. Yet the state underestimated the roots Aviles planted. Cutting the trunk just let branches spread stronger and freer. Sinaloa post-Aviles became a violence lab later exported nationwide. A blood legacy Pedro started, but his heirs perfected. His story reminds that in the drug fight, victories are often Pyrrhic and heroes' hands as dirty as villains. The Lion of the Sierra is now a wax figure in Mexico's Museum of Horrors, a man whose daring changed history's course and whose death started the cartel era. Pedro Aviles Perez, the first great master whose shadow never leaves the Sierra Madre. This criminal odyssey's first great chapter brewed in the Great Depression years, when need pushed many Sinaloans to seek alternatives outside legality. Pedro Aviles, still a teen, grasped the economic system was designed to favor a few, and that breaking those chains required implacable determination. His first big smuggling op is said to be cattle north, using secret paths only he and his men knew. This terrain knowledge was his later success base. He knew where to hide, ambush, and escape when things turned dangerous. A loyalty he inspired in his mule drivers wasn't free. Pedro always paid more than anyone and ensured his men's families never went hungry, even if they fell in duty. This work ethic, twisted as it was, cemented Sinaloa Criminal Brotherhood's foundations, a code of silence withstanding the toughest tests for nearly a century. As cattle business gave way to illegal plants, Aviles simply adapted logistics to the new goods, keeping the same discretion and security principles. He brought the first high-quality opium seeds to the Sierra, seeds introduced to Mexico by Chinese immigrants decades earlier that Pedro acclimated to Sinaloa conditions. This raw material mastery gave him an unbeatable competitive edge, letting him offer product clandestinely demanded by U.S. pharmaceuticals during war years. Pedro Aviles Perez was also a visionary in communication tech. He installed rudimentary radio stations on Sierra high points, letting his bases communicate and alert on rural patrols. This early comms system gave him a tactical edge over the government, whose troops often moved blind through unfamiliar territory. Pedro spent hours listening to police frequencies, learning authority codes, and anticipating moves with astonishing precision. This intel let him survive post-war capture attempts when the Mexican government timidly tried imposing order in the region. Aviles mocked federal inefficiency, often sending taunting messages via informants or leaving signs of his presence where soldiers had just passed. His legend grew with each miraculous escape. He fueled by word of mouth from a population seeing him as a rebel against Mexico City's centralist system. But Pedro wasn't a simple outlaw. He was a network builder, seeking to integrate his business into Sinaloa's economic life irreversibly. He started funding local small industries, mechanic shops, and transport companies, serving as covers for his main ops, entangling legal and illegal economies in a way still hard to untangle today. In the 1950s, Pedro Aviles solidified his alliance with pilots bridging to the United States, men operating from forgotten desert airports in Arizona and New Mexico. These night flights, done without lights and low altitude, were his empire's backbone, getting Sinaloa drugs to consumption centers in hours. But Aviles paid handsomely to mechanics keeping these planes in extreme flight conditions and handled bribing air traffic controllers and border agents watching the skies. It was during this period that ties brewed with U.S. drug mafias, especially groups controlling California's black market. Pedro occasionally traveled north to oversee deliveries and tighten international partner bonds, moving with astonishing ease in alien cities. His U.S. partners respected him for his word and supply consistency, even in toughest conditions. This international network made Sinaloa heroin known in big U.S. cities' slums as high-fidelity product, a prestige Aviles defended with constant vigilance over every shipment. Money returning to Sinaloa was invested in irrigation upgrades and farm machinery buys for his network peasants, transforming the Sierra landscape in ways the state never achieved. Pedro Aviles's political maturity showed in his ability to influence local elections, ensuring mayors and police chiefs were his trusted men. He didn't need to run for office. Being the grand elector behind the curtain sufficed, the one deciding who rose and fell in state power ranks. His campaign donations were legendary, always cash and traceless, guaranteeing private audiences with any needed official. Aviles grasped before anyone that Mexican trafficking couldn't exist without political power's consent, or at least indifference, dedicating much of his career to perfecting this cohabitation system. The plaza, as he conceived it, wasn't just geographic territory, but a mutual understanding space where criminal and ruler shared vice rents. And this institutionalized corruption model allowed Sinaloa's decades-long peace, a peace based on equitable, illegal gains, sharing and population social control via economic benefit. Pedro was this balance's guarantor, the man ending band wars before drawing too much attention and punishing disloyal with warnings serving decisiveness. Yet the 1970s arrival brought a new geopolitical reality threatening Aviles' system. The U.S. government under Richard Nixon declared war on drugs, and Mexico was this new moral political crusade's first target. Pedro initially tried ignoring the threat, trusting solid connections in Luis Echeverria's government, but soon realized external pressure was too strong, even for his mightiest protectors. Northbound flights started getting intercepted more often. He and his Sierra landing strips were spotted by surveillance satellites Pedro couldn't see or fight. Operation Condor was this pressure's final result, an op designed to uproot Sinaloa kingpin's power through pure military force. Pedro Aviles found himself on defense for the first time, watching ranches raided and labs destroyed by soldiers rejecting dialogue proposals. Aviles' resistance during Operation Condor mixed guerrilla tactics and institutional sabotage. He ordered men to retreat to the Sierra's highest peaks and destroy crop traces before troops arrived. But herbicides were a devastating blow to his network's economy. Thousands of marijuana hectares were razed in days, leaving peasants without livelihood and Pedro without goods. The following financial crisis tested his organization's cohesion, with some younger partners questioning his leadership and seeking own escape routes. Aviles responded with an internal purge, eliminating those he saw as survival threats. But discord's seed was planted. Paranoia gripped his days, feeling the state had betrayed him and his glory days ending. It was in this period he delegated more to Miguel Felix Gallardo, a man skilled at navigating city police and political spheres with an ease Pedro, the Sierra man, no longer had. Under Aviles' tutelage, Felix Gallardo began building what'd be the cocaine network, linking with Medellin and Cali Colombian cartels. Pedro saw this new business as a way to recover losses and diversify risk, letting protégés lead the transition to the new market. But this shift also meant his hegemony's end. The cocaine business required scales and violence. Aviles, always discretion's advocate, found dangerous. Youths growing in his shadow no longer respected Sierra traditions. They were city men, schooled in police corruption and excessive luxury, seeing Pedro as a venerable elder, but outpaced by new global market realities. Tension between old master and new pupils was the final tragedy's prelude. Some are said to have leaked Aviles' movement info to speed generational handover and consolidate own power. The Lion of the Sierra found himself alone in a world he'd helped create, surrounded by traitors waiting for the opportune moment to inherit his throne. On September 15, 1978, Pedro Aviles Perez decided to travel to Culiacan for what he believed was a peace meeting with federal government emissaries, a meeting meant to negotiate ending the Sierra's military siege. He traveled in his Ford Bronco, a vehicle symbolizing his status and all-terrain mobility, confident in safe passages his contacts promised. But the safe passage was a trap, and contacts bought or threatened by the new administration seeking a media splash. The Tepuche checkpoint had elite troops, not from local garrison, men unknowing of Aviles' name or respecting his legend. When the truck stopped, there was no negotiation chance. The air filled with lead, and Pedro's life slipped through ambush wounds he should have anticipated. The first great Mexican narco's body lay on the asphalt. A humiliating end for a man believing himself the mountain's owner. The Aviles' death was celebrated in Mexico City and Washington offices as an impunity era's end, but reality was it just unleashed demons Pedro kept controlled. His heirs, freed from the master's oversight, started an internal plaza control war, leaving hundreds dead in Culiacan and Guadalajara streets. Drug trafficking stopped being Sierra gentlemen's business to become industrialized massacre with no rules or honor codes. Felix Gallardo, the shrewdest, finally unified factions under the Guadalajara Cartel, but at indiscriminate violence's cost, drawing full U.S. government attention. Aviles' legacy was perverted by his pupil's ambition, who used Pedro's infrastructure to create a monster devouring the country today. Sinaloa was never the same. But the Lion of the Sierra's forced peace was replaced by perpetual war, leaving thousands disappeared and a death culture permeating every state corner. Today, Pedro Aviles Perez's figure is studied as a social disease's origin point, with no cure in sight. He taught Mexico illegality can be more profitable than law and corruption, a more effective government form than democracy. His border-crossing daring and network-weaving intelligence were his greatest virtues, but also tools of his and his region's destruction. The Sierra remains immense and silent, guarding Pedro's bunker secrets and stories of night flights that never returned. The Lion of the Sierra is a myth, a ghost haunting Tepuche roads, reminding us in the vice world, final reward is oblivion or a lead burst in an orange sunset. His story is the warning no one heeded. A bloody prologue to a book still written with betrayal's ink and a people's pain who knows no peace. Pedro Aviles' influence also felt in creating trafficking's first internal ethics codes. Unwritten rules banning own merchandise use among organization members and demanding absolute respect for partners' families. Aviles believed personal discipline was longevity's key in business and punished harshly those lost in alcohol or drug excesses. This criminal puritanism let his network run like clockwork for decades, avoiding internal disputes, ruining smaller delinquent groups. Pedro saw himself as an industry captain, someone simply meeting market demand most efficiently, without guilt or moral remorse. To him, government's hypocrisy, banning drugs while benefiting from taxes and bribes, was true criminality. And this cynical worldview let him navigate Mexican politics' turbulent waters without losing course, always true to his interest and organizations. But Aviles' cynicism didn't protect him from Sinaloa society's mindset shift, starting to view, with horror, youths recruited for a war not theirs. Sierra's first human rights and peasant defense organizations arose responding to Operation Condor's and Pedro's own organization's violence. Aviles tried quelling these protests through charity and intimidation, but civil resistance's seed was planted. The Lion of the Sierra found himself fighting not just soldiers and federal agents, but part of his own social base tired of living under gun law. This popular support erosion was perhaps the hardest blow for a man basing power on Sierra respect and loyalty. At his life's end was constant retreat to a non-existent past, a desperate bid to keep in order the modern world was set on destroying. Pedro Aviles Perez's Culiacan funeral demonstrated his figure's duality. Thousands of Sierra peasants traveled days to bid farewell to their boss, but there was also discreet presence of political and business figures seeking own interests' continuity. It was an event marked by banda music, shots in the air, and uncertainty about Sinaloa's future. The Lion of the Sierra was dead, but his system lived on, ready for claim by younger, ambitious hands. The cemetery where he rests became a cult site, a monument to the primal narco era, still inspiring those seeking crime as poverty escape. His epitaph could have been one word: ambition. There's an ambition taking him from nothing to the world's top, but also snatching everything in a military checkpoint one September 15th. Pedro Aviles Perez's story is ultimately 20th century Mexico's mirror, a country that couldn't or wouldn't solve deep inequalities and let drug trafficking become its most prosperous industry. Aviles was this disease's symptom and cause, a man of his time who capitalized on his nation's weaknesses to build a shadow empire. His legacy lingers in every gram crossing the border and every life lost in the cartel war. Pedro Aviles Perez died nearly half a century ago, but his shadow is longer than ever, roaming Sinaloa fields and Mexico streets with oblivion-defying persistence. The Lion of the Sierra is gone, but gunpowder's roar remains our daily reality's soundtrack. What remains of Pedro Aviles today? It a corruption system that's mutated but not died. Roots still used under new commands, and a culture celebrating the criminal while forgetting victims. His life was a power lesson, his death a betrayal lesson, and his legacy an open wound in Mexico's heart. Sinaloa remains the storm's epicenter, a territory still without the peace Pedro Aviles promised through Plaza law. The First Master left us a world of shadows, and we're still trying to find the path to light. Thanks for joining us on this trek through Pedro Aviles Perez's life. May his story help us not repeat past mistakes and understand no flower crown can hide blood smell spilled by ambition. See you in the next story of those changing the world from darkness. Pedro Aviles Perez was also a counterintelligence pioneer. He's said to have infiltrators in all Sinaloa government offices, from the fishing delegation to the governor's office, letting him anticipate any legal move against him. This spy network was his life insurance, letting him operate with freedom no other delinquent of his era dreamed. Pedro spent hours analyzing confidential reports his spies delivered in sealed envelopes, studying judges and prosecutors' bios to find weak points, be it greed, vice, or family. This scientific crime approach elevated him from simple trafficker to institutional control master. Aviles didn't just buy silence. He bought men's will, turning them into his chess pawns where he always played white. His death was a change in that chess's rules. The state no longer sought his collaboration, but his head as diplomatic currency. A Pedro Aviles was a decades-consuming war's first major sacrifice. A war where names change, but results are always the same. Sinaloa today reflects what Pedro started, a state where illegality is part of social DNA, and the narco figure remains thousands of futureless youth's only success model. The Lion of the Sierra opened a path, now a violence highway, and his name forever etched in a nation's black history, that couldn't protect its children from easy money's temptation and absolute power. Pedro Aviles Perez rests under Culiacan's sun, while the world he created keeps taking lives in ambition and tragedy's endless cycle.